How do we one-up our SLI versus Crossfire breakdown from last year? Simple, we double up on everything that's not already maxed out. So finding a way to have 4 instead of 2 cards in each setup sounds like a good idea, right? We welcome you to witness our arduous journey with our 2009 Ultimate High-End Gaming PC. It is not mandatory, as we'll provide here all the necessary context, but if you haven't seen our 2008 high-end build, we recommend you to do so. We'll once again use our Asus Rampage 2 Extreme, the same x58 board we used last year. This HEDT platform was the pinnacle of Intel's offer back in 2009, and will be for the next few years. x58 chipset supports both NVIDIA's SLI and AMD's Crossfire, so we can pair multiple graphics cards from both vendors. And yes, you are not seeing extra. There are 6 memory slots, and this platform runs in the triple channel configuration. The very best CPU for our setup from 2009 is i7-9750EE or Extreme Edition. With a bit higher base clock and a bit higher boost clock, it is somewhat more powerful than the i7-965 or i7-960 we used as a substitute in our 2008 high-end. It has 4 cores, 8 threads, and a total of 8 MB of shared L3 cache. Our Rampage board can house more powerful CPUs, such as the very first 6-core i7-980X. But that one was released in 2010, so it was unavailable for purchase by the end of 2009, and therefore disqualified from this build. We'll cool it using a brand new Endorfy Fera 5. It's a nice cooler that supports many older sockets. For memory, we'll, as we usually do, go completely balls to the wall with a total of 24 GB. We have 6 slots and will populate every single one of them with Corsair Vengeance 4GB DDR3 1600 MHz sticks. Is there a need for such an extraordinary amount of memory? Not at all. Then why? Why not? For external memory, we wanted to go with one of the first SSDs on the market, with the same Kingston SSDNow we used in our 2009 mid to high-end PC. But here we come to our problem number 1, as our motherboard's SATA controller failed to recognize the drive. Funny, considering that it had no issues with any other drive we tried. So we'll just use any SATA SSD we have available, which happens to be this Gigabyte 480GB one. Before you ask, were there SSDs in 2009? Yes, and they were starting to be widely available. And now, the main stars of our little show, and also the main source of problems, the graphics cards. Even though we did our research and knew the correct answer, we prepared 2 cards from both NVIDIA and AMD. We'll pit them against each other to find out ourselves which ones belong in our 2009 Ultimate machine. In NVIDIA corner we have 2 of the GeForce GTX 295, the dual GPU cards, which are the very best from NVIDIA's Tesla architecture. Calling this dual GPU is a bit misleading, as it's actually 2 physical cards connected via an internal SLI bridge with a single cooling solution. Each card has its GPU, memory, power supply, outputs, and one of them has a PCI Express connector. They are in a sandwich configuration around the blower-style cooler, which can pull air from both sides or from the back or top. Really cool solution from NVIDIA. It even has a board cutout similar to the ones RTX 3000 series Founder Edition cards have. There also exists a single board variant. The same design is also featured on the partner model, which is Asus in this case. Still, these cards tend to get really hot, which is not ideal for putting them next to each other in the SLI setup. Single board has the same specs as the GTX 275, like the one we used in our 2009 mid-range to high-end, but it's clocked more akin to the GTX 260. Same as both GTX 275 and GTX 260, it has a nice round number of 896 MB per card, over the same 448-bit bus each. The nice thing about it is, you put it inside of your machine, you already have a hassle-free SLI setup with a bit better compatibility and driver support. As it only has one SLI connector, you can put only 2 of these in a larger SLI setup, for a total of 4 cards in SLI. AMD has an answer for that in the form of a Radeon HD 5970, dual GPU card connected via internal onboard Crossfire connection. It might seem weird today, but in 2009 AMD was number 1 in the GPU market, with only shortages of its cards preventing it from dominating the charts. This position resulted in higher pricing as well, as a single card had at the time a huge price of $600, which is 100 extra over the GTX 295. Each card has a core configuration of an HD 5870 and has the same clock as an HD 5850. Each card has 1 GB of memory over a 256-bit bus. There are also 2 x 2 GB or 4 GB total variants of these cards. However, review dates point out that this version appeared in 2010. Both of our cards, one from Asus and another from XFX, feature the same sports car look, with fancy exhausts, which are actually intakes. Being the single-board solution, the cooler is a more traditional blower style, with the hefty task of cooling a 294-watt TDP card. Cards have a single Crossfire connector, so only 2 can go in a setup, for a total of 4 cards in Crossfire. You may notice that there are a lot of similarities between HD 5970 and GTX 295, so it makes it even more interesting to put these toe-to-toe. For power supply, we have 2 units, one which we aim to use for this setup, and one just in case the first one is not up to the task. The first one is the same 1000-watt LC Power LC1000M we used in the 2008 high-end build. It is a decent power supply, although we are cutting it a bit too close to the power limit. It's our main pick since it has 4 separate cables with PCI Express power connectors, which can be considered good practice in cases such as this one. The other one is the brand new 1200-watt NZXT C1200. This one is there in case the first one is not enough. We recently acquired this one, particularly for cases such as this, and it was really stretching our budget. Once again, both of these are new power supplies. Thanks to long-lasting ATX standards, they are perfectly compatible with our old hardware. We do not recommend using old PSUs that are in a questionable state, as you could easily lose your precious hardware. This is the list of parts we are using for this PC. The build process for this one is no different than any other multiple GPU setup we've done so far, so we'll show only the highlights. In the future, we'll only record the whole process if there's some interesting gimmick, a nice case or something else in that vein. Besides, we have assembled and disassembled this machine around 15 times. I kid you not. You do not want to see that. So, what went wrong? The first issue we encountered was the SSD one we already mentioned. We tried different ports and different cables, but no luck, so we counted our losses and proceeded further. We've installed Windows 7, games, benchmarks, and proceeded to test a single GTX 295, one from Asus. The testing went well, and the Asus GTX 295 matched or exceeded our expectations in all of the tests. The other GTX 295, one that had NVIDIA listed as its vendor, caused our motherboard's video error beep codes. This card worked fine in the past, and we used it in our Crysis benchmark breakdown a few years ago. However, when cleaned and repasted, the card once again sprung to life. The next problem came to light when we tested the card. Funny enough, the card was stable and able to finish multiple tests. The results were the ones that made us scratch our heads. If you observe the results in Unigine Heaven and 3D Mark 06, you will notice that they appear as slightly weaker GTX 275, as if it was downclocked. The first clues appeared when we figured out that there are no SLI options in NVIDIA control panel, and CPUZ showed only one card from the drop-down menu. So, what is going on here? Well, it appears that one of the two GPUs on this graphics sandwich is dead, and the other one just works as if nothing happened. What makes this even weirder, the card with DVI outputs is the one that works, and that one doesn't even have a PCI Express connection. The dead GPU card functions as a PCI Express riser for the one still working. That explains the weird, underwhelming result that we got from this GTX 295 on our Crysis breakdown testing. GeForce GTX 295 is fairly rare, and there are only a few working ones on the local market. An interesting coincidence is that the working ones had benchmark results listed, and they were as underwhelming as our faulty unit ones. This means that we're not finding another working GTX 295 anytime soon. That means that our dream of 4-way SLI is dead. But how about 3-way? SLI doesn't support asymmetrical pairing, which means that cards have to be the same model for it to work. Even though we do have 3 GTX 295 halves, drivers do not accept it as such, which is a bummer. From there, we went on to testing Radeon cards. And much to our delight, they both worked like a charm, providing us with competitive performance. And yes, the Asus one was a better performer again, but this time by a slim margin. As soon as we finished testing both of them, we assembled a Crossfire setup and fought AMD drivers until it had figured out that we had essentially 4 cards in our setup and managed to put them in a 4-way Crossfire. Now this is a sight to behold. Which brings us to our last problem. When we conducted testing in a few games, the performance was outright terrible. In Tomb Raider, where a single 5970 breezed through the benchmark for almost 400 FPS, 2 were helplessly chugging along for barely 40. These results are far below even a single HD 5970 and much below HD 5750, which we used in our 2009 budget build. This appalling performance was consistent across many different versions of AMD drivers, flipping the cards and replacing the Crossfire bridge. We tried using a different PSU, our new NZXT unit, but the issues persisted, with the results being consistently terrible. Known working cards with a known working Crossfire bridge on a known working system. What is the problem here? Truth be told, we don't know. This result is, to be honest, the most disappointing one we could get, being so close and yet so far. If you happen to have any knowledge, ideas or remedies for our situation, please do comment them below. We'll be grateful for your help in this matter. In any way, at least for now, our dream of a 4-way Crossfire is dead. But not all is lost, as we do have dual SLI and Crossfire results. We'll compare them to 2008 high-end and 2009 mid-range to high-end results. We'll start the results breakdown with Crysis, and yes, both AMD and NVIDIA setups can run it. GTX 295 dominates on all but the very high preset, whereas HD 5970 pushes the envelope a bit further. During research, we encountered claims that HD 5970 is not so good in Crysis, so these results are not so surprising. GTX 295 is trading blows with a dual GTX 280 setup, which is fantastic considering that a single GTX 280 cost $600 only a year earlier. Next, we have Mafia II, one known NVIDIA favoring title, and what's going on in the high preset? Radeon providing us with 30% more performance. It's worth considering that high refresh rate monitors were not popular in 2009, and all above 60 can be considered somewhat of an excess. All the variants perform excellently in this title, especially considering the unexpected cost reduction of all things, compared to GTX 280 SLI. 2013 Tomb Raider is an absolute bloodbath in favor of HD 5970. Especially so when you consider that the GTX 200 series does not support this game's Ultra and Ultimate presets. At this point, 4-year-old cards that give the output of more than 300 frames, even on the low preset, are outright ridiculous. The Radeon card variant dominates the results and rapidly outperforms the GTX 280 SLI setup, even without 4 GPU configuration. Wolfenstein New Order continues the trend. It's necessary to consider here that this game is capped at 60 FPS. Radeon provides around 30% better performance at a 20% steeper price. So it's not only a top performer, it also has a better price to performance ratio. Then we get to The Witcher 3: The Wild Hunt. We once again get to see the familiar "cannot run" message that we get from all GTX 200 cards. But a bit younger, newer architecture card that is Radeon HD 5970 manages to run it without a hitch. Performance is not great, but the game is playable at the low preset, on what in 2015 was a 6-year-old graphics card. Here are the results for the synthetic benchmarks that we ran. We haven't tested any upgraded setup, like for example with a better graphics card. Here you can see the results we got with 2008 high-end and GTX 1063GB. The performance you can expect from those early i7s is actually quite excellent, making the most of the newer games at least playable, if you can provide it with enough graphical power. The only limitation is the PCI Express 2.0, but even that is not much of a handicap. The system runs smoothly and is stable. Day-to-day usage and occasional gaming work as a charm, easily beating some newer low-end setups. Of course, it's worth mentioning that this platform is not supported by Windows 11, so the future of these is pretty much wearing a tuxedo. That concludes our treasure hunt here, and perhaps the real treasure was all the dead cards we collected along the way. Nihilistic jokes aside, this was quite an endeavor, and as always took much longer than we anticipated. The bleeding edge is always sharp and cuts deeply, even if it's old, cheap and literally rusty. Even though we haven't achieved what we aimed for, this machine is more than impressive with a single dual card. In the end, we hope that this was informative, educational and fun for everyone. And we hope to see you around for the next one. And we might stay a bit away from decades-old complex machines with many probably already faulty points of failure. What's this? Ah, for f***'s sake!